exploration of a reflection, an extended reflection really throughout this, much of this chapter on the parable of the Prodigal Son, which you find in Luke chapter 15. As I'll mention today in the reading, chapter 15 of Luke is actually comprised of three parables of the lost and the found, this being the most detailed of the three, the other being the lost sheep and the lost coin. It is for this chapter that many people call Luke's gospel the happy gospel, because it is a happy gospel, and it's a beautiful gospel through and through, but in particular, the lavishness of God's love and mercy just comes through in these palpable ways. So this morning's reading actually includes a lengthy reflection or reading from Luke himself on the parable. And so you'll pardon me that the first reading is a bit long, because I wanted then to have the paragraphs around that to kind of situate that and help explain it. So we'll get underway. Let me call up our, let's see. Nope, sorry, wrong one. Oops, I might not have it open here. I'm sorry. Give me just one moment. Okay, sorry about that. So as always, welcome and benum Christ in it. I greet Christ in you and welcome you here this morning. We begin with an opening prayer. So keep watch over my heart, O God. Keep vigil over the shadows, the dark valleys where I hide. Go quickly, Lord, to the faraway places to which I run, that you may precede me there, that your love may precede me there, and overshadow me with your light. Amen. So for those of you following along in the book, you'll see the citation from Luke 15, starting on page 71 and following. So quoting Luke's gospel, then Jesus said, there was a man who had two sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me. So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired hands have bread enough to spare? But here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands. So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around his neck and kissed him. Then the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. The father said to his slaves, quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. So since the 16th century, most English Bibles have referred to this passage as the Prodigal Son, though perhaps a more suitable title would be the Prodigal Father. The term prodigal means extravagantly wasteful, reckless, or uncontrolled. More broadly, it implies giving something away on a lavish scale. While the son is extravagant and wasteful in his use of money, the father, who is the central figure of the story, as we see in verse 11, conveys a love for his son that is more extravagant still, so lavish and uncontrolled as to be rightly called prodigal. The two other parables that comprise chapter 15 are the lost sheep, as we see in Luke 15:17 and following, and the lost coin, as we see in Luke 15:8 through 10. Together, these three have been called by some commentators the heart of Luke's gospel, because they so distinctively reveal Luke's portrait of Christ as one who seeks out the lost, the exiled, and the outcast. So let us meditate together on this prodigal love of God, and I'll see you on the other side. So our second reading comes from page 72. In all three parables, which we find in chapter 15 of Luke's Gospel, it is God who actively searches for the lost. There is no divine passivity in response to the human plight of exile. The sheep does not find its way back to the flock, but is actively sought out and returned by the shepherd. The woman's lost coin does not miraculously reappear, but is found only by her strenuous efforts to light the lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully. So too is the young man's sojourn through a distant country ultimately interrupted by his father, who goes out to embrace him while he is still on the way. So that theme of God rushing out to greet us while we are still on the way will become a theme we'll be working with over the next few weeks together. So let us pray. I've retained the prayer from our closing of last week because of its relevance for this parable. Loving God, there is no room in you for words of apology. You seek only a contrite heart. There is no room in you for us to run away, for your embrace is all-encompassing. There is no room in you for the eternal distance between us, for your imperishable spirit is everywhere, and your word has made a home in us. Stir my heart, O Lord, to know I am already home. Amen. And that brings us to our time of sharing. Hi, Brother Columba. Good to see you.
Hello, Father. Good to see you too, as always. Very typical for me this day. Today we read this story of the prodigal son in our Eucharist this morning.
Oh, how nice.
So what came up for me was to hear that story again. A little story I wrote down. The story is for me exactly how God deals with us. Sin, when you put it in the light of this story, can you declare in this way? That what keeps you away from God. That which not make you act in and from love, his love. We became dead for his love. you can say. As the father of the prodigal son, God welcomes us back with open arms because we arose from the dead. We came back alive by his everlasting love for us again, again, and again.
Yeah, Brother Columba, that's absolutely beautiful. Thank you for that. I wonder if you'll permit me just one word to reconsider in your beautiful reflection. And so rather than say necessarily welcomes us back, I wonder if in the story we would replace welcomes with brings. He brings us back. And this is one of the key elements that I think is so profound that I tried to spell out just now in that last paragraph, that the difference is a subtle one, but I think an important one for the incarnation, which is to say that the Father doesn't stay at home waiting to welcome the Son, but goes out actively in search of and brings him home. And I think that nuance is so central to the incarnation, which is the historical moment in which God is doing that, not in a theoretical way or a hypothetical way, but in a physical, material way. The Son, in this sense, Christ represents, as I'll say later, the kiss of the Father to humanity, embracing us and bringing us home. That would be the only thought I might share with you in an otherwise beautiful reflection.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Nice. Okay, you're very welcome. Pat, please. Oh, sorry, Pat. You just need to unmute there.
There we go. Okay. You introduced this whole parable as a recasting of Genesis 2 and 3. And so I'm seeing in the beginning of the prodigal son parable, and the son says to the father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me. And then immediately, so he divided his property between them. So I was wondering, exploring that a bit more. There's no hesitancy shown on the part of the father. And then in looking at this as a reflection or recasting of Genesis, I'm sorry to see this is also free will. There was no hesitancy on the part of God to let Adam and Eve make the choice to eat of the fruit. And here the Father, representing God, is not hesitating to talk the Son out of taking this inheritance early and knowing that he could possibly be squandering it.
Yeah, Pat, I think I think you're right to point to what could really be a fruitful reflection in both cases on the notion of free will. In some ways, and I say this with a light heart, the fact that the story of Eden places this beautiful, luscious tree at the center of the garden is kind of like, putting broccoli out on the table and a big chocolate cake in the middle and telling your kid you can eat everything but the chocolate cake. There's a sense in which it's a little bit of an unfair kind of thing to do, right? And Paul will address this in his understanding of law versus freedom. If you look at Romans 7, once the law is introduced, it actually introduces the temptation to break the law. Which is why he ultimately says the law served a purpose, but we're now free from that. And I think that, to your point, is the question of free will is absolutely at stake here. I mean, in many ways, for a child to go to their parents and say, I want my inheritance now, is on some level saying you're as good as dead to me, I think.
Yeah.
There's a sense in which there's a real rejection that if we really were to explore the psychology of the characters, say with some artistic license, there would be a deep wound there, I think, of rejection. But part of the beauty of Israel's theology of a covenanting God is precisely around God's vulnerability. And the vulnerability comes in because we can reject the covenant. We can reject God's overtures toward freedom and love and relationship. This is unheard of in the pagan world. There's nothing vulnerable about Zeus or Marduk or any of these other, or Baal. The idea that the Israelites had a God who was vulnerable vulnerable enough to put himself and herself in the position of being rejected speaks of a divine humility that is really quite distinctive in the ancient world, and still today, I think. So yeah, I think the idea here really is about this freedom, right? It's sort of what inspired a little bit my opening prayer this morning, for God to anticipate this rejection and then to go to those places where we'll hide, to precede us there in a way as, in a sense, revealing this infinite love that's ultimately behind it all. Beautiful. Yeah. So I would agree on those parallels for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome, of course. Oh, hi, Carl. Good morning. Good to see you here.
So I apologize. I can't get video. The video function just doesn't seem to work today. So I was meditating on the nature of the exile, both in Genesis and in the parable. In the parable, of course, the exile is towards the unclean, which is, the Jewish Hebrew understanding of the pigs. I mean, it's the metaphor, but the metaphor is much broader than that. It goes to a self-chosen exile into a material world that mistakenly the self-exiler believes is separate from God, separate from the Father, and untouched by the Father's generosity and spirit. So the return from exile is an awakening in that comes from the Father, but through the exiled Son, and an understanding that the world of the pigs, the unclean world, is dead. The world outside of the garden is dead. Yes, it's his inheritance, but it's only really his inheritance when God is there. And so there is an act of the Father in rushing out to fill that void, but there is also an act of acceptance that's a necessary one for the person. He's realized that the empty, material, unclean world of the pigs is not enough, and he turns. And the Father, that is the opening that the Father needs.
That's right. There's a saying, I'm looking for the way that it's worded here. Let me see. Yeah, the wording in the translation that I used here about the Son himself is while he's out, and many of the early fathers, by the way, interpret allegorically the famine, I think, along the lines of what you're saying, Carl. The famine is an interior famine. He's starving for intimacy with God, that this is not to be taken necessarily as at face value, but that we're seeing here, despite all of his money and all of the fortune, in that separation, as you say, that self-imposed exile, we enter into a place of spiritual famine because we have separated ourselves from that intimacy, which God does indeed rush out to fill. But to your point, earlier in the text, right before we hear the Son's sort of decision to go home, the way that the translation, which is the NRSV here, puts it is that he came to himself. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my Father's hands have bread enough to spare?" Another translation that you'll hear in that is he came to his senses. It is rare that we get a glimpse of the interiority of a biblical character. Most everything is interpreted on the level of external behavior. So this is actually a telling moment where we're hearing about the inner life, however briefly, about this sense of before he returns to the Father, he returns to himself and realizes the state he's in, and that motivates his return. So he recognizes this is terrible. I've made an awful decision here, and it's led to this, disaster. There is, no mistaking the fact that for any Jew who is hearing this story in first century Palestine would be revolted at the idea that he is tempted to eat out of a pig trough. Pigs being what they were, you couldn't eat or consume or even herd pigs. So the idea that you would be reduced to such a state that you'd be willing to share their trough is a pretty bad state to be in, right? Spiritually and otherwise. So the whole thing bespeaks, I think, this notion of alienation, self-imposed exile, and the state of starvation that comes when we impose that exile on ourselves in pursuit of things that we believe, of course, that will be fulfilling, which clearly aren't. Right? Yeah. So well said. I just have to share very briefly, very quickly. Brother Brendan had to leave us, but his note is absolutely endearing. In his haste, he spelled eek, which, as many of you may know, is the Flemish or Dutch. So it's just funny that he did that. I'm noticing that now. So anyway, Carl, I hope that helps sort of give a sense of, of affirmation. I think you're onto something there. Let's see, Sue, please. Hi.
Yeah, good morning. I've been feeling more emotional than normal these last couple of weeks. And, I almost just wanted to have my camera off and just weep from what you've shared already today, because it just feels so beautiful to focus and to ask for help, to really just accept this extravagant love. Mm-hmm. And also I feel really touched by your prayers, and especially when what it's saying to me is it actually is impossible to not be in God's love. And a bit like you were just saying, it's only when I somehow can put a blanket over that in my mind, or deny that I'm seeing it, or deny that I'm worthy. It's like I'm the one that's denying it. I'm the one that's doing that. And so in a way, it's like this is the path I want to follow. This is what I want as an experience. It doesn't feel like it's an experience every day. But I love your prayer where it basically is saying, if I run away, you're there, and help me to see really that I'm just already at home, mm-hmm. and I've never been anywhere else. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, I just had that image, those, I don't know what they're called. You often have them like at Christmas. They're a little sort of plastic or glass bubble, and there's a scene inside, and then you can shake it, and there's this life going on, but it's not really real. It's like going on in the presence of something greater. And so it's my prayer today that I would just really know that I'm only ever in God's extravagant love.
Sue, thank you. That's beautiful. Nothing really fills me more than that kind of awakening in the heart to that love when I'm with people and we kind of have that awakening together. And so thank you for sharing that. It's really what makes life worth living, as far as I'm concerned, just as we come to those moments. And I remember a Franciscan friar when I was in high school we were on retreat, and he talked about how we take for granted this vast, immense size of the universe. And he just sort of posed, why does it have to be that big? Why couldn't the universe end like 20 feet, beyond the atmosphere of Earth? I mean, if that's indeed what God wanted or whatever. And his point was, who is all this this beauty and extravagance for? What is its purpose? And so he was just really moving us to, I think, to really reflect on that place of awe and how that everything becomes an expression of that extravagant love, so that we realize there is no other place we could be but embraced in that. Some of you may know, if you're in high liturgical traditions, around the time when we celebrate the Eucharist, we talk about our acclamation of faith. And the way that we pray it in our contemplative rite here is, dying you destroyed illusion, rising you restored our union. Maranatha, come Lord Jesus, Alpha and Omega. And those of you who are congregants here will know that. And the reason when I wrote that liturgy, I talked about dying you destroyed illusion is precisely to hint at the idea that what the whole passion of Christ is about is to destroy the illusion that we are separate from God. And it's the illusion that gets destroyed in Christ. And in that sense does become a restorative way of inviting us back from our little bubbles, little snow bubbles, right? Into that bigger reality, and to realize that everything is happening within that bigger universe, that we just get caught up in this little snow bubble and think that that's the end of things. And so to break that bubble open and to suddenly realize, oh, wait a minute, that's the illusion that gets destroyed. That's what the incarnation reveals, is that this love of God can only be one in which we are in a perpetual embrace. And if there is an idea of revelation, it is not the notion of God revealing the divine self to humanity, but us revealing ourselves to God, who is always in search of us. And that's where revelation, I think, happens in our own consciousness around that. And when we really embrace that, when that breaks through to us from a head thing to a heart thing, it's life-changing. It's just completely transformational to understand that dynamic. So I'm glad you didn't shut down your camera, Sue. And thank you for sharing today. It's good to hear you. Okay, and that brings us to Thelma and/or Michael. Please.
Good morning, Vincent.
Morning.
Michael, to start with here, as you know, this parable touches greatly in our house, and it touches on so many points, from the prodigal son who returned to the then not prodigal son, but father who has a son who has turned away. First of all, I want to just say, I don't think that the idea that the father just let the son leave with his inheritance. The son gets to, and all children get to, a point where they have to become their own adult, at which point they leave and they take with them what they were taught and what they know. Now, what they do with that after they leave is no longer up to the parent. And it can be very heart-wrenching as to the decisions they make, because often they are opposite of what the parent wants.
Right.
Then I will turn to another full thing, and that is that the parent is always loving of the child in heart. The parent can become totally anchored by the child and the rebelliousness. The battles between children and parents go on forever as well. However, I believe that God's love for us is always there. And I kind of look at it in a way now, this is taking it way outside, but we start as stardust and we become a human only with the addition of some spark from God. That spark never leaves. We can turn our back to it, but if you stand in the sun outside and you turn your back to it, maybe the sun isn't in your eyes anymore, but it's still there. Okay, and it's always there. So then comes the acceptance. The only way we know God is to turn to God. God's always there for me, has always been there for me. But I was also given a choice that I could turn my back if I want to. It doesn't mean that God's love goes away. It just means that I'm turning away from it. And then comes my choice to turn back to it. And I would know as a parent that if a child turns back towards me and towards what I believe is good for him, it's going to be joyous for me, just fully joyous. And I don't know that I can't comprehend God, so I don't know whether God, how much joy God gets from us turning back to Him. That gets beyond comprehension, but there's also very little spoken of the prodigal son and the mother, because the mother's always there and perhaps holds an even deeper bond in a different place in the heart than the father.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. I appreciate that reflection. And I think if we take the parable at face value, the joy of God in any moment that we turn, and the prodigal son tells us as a kind of a one-shot deal, but I think there is a constant, our whole spiritual life becomes a constant turning, a constant return, a constant turning back. Many times a day, many times in an instant, and with each one of those is this heavenly rejoicing. Some of the fathers say that the most pure form of prayer is the very instant, the moment that you in consciousness turn to pray. The moment you intend to pray is the moment, because it's the moment we turn our hearts, our minds, ourselves to the divine, and becomes in itself, before any words are spoken, before any silence is kept, it becomes that moment in which we return again to the Father, as it were, and the Father rushes out and greets us. So this is a beautiful, there is never a moment in which we are not being sought after and being embraced, and that party isn't going on around that. So thank you.
Thank you.
So yes, please, Linda, hi, good morning.
Good morning. So first, I just wanted to say that I love Carl's sharing on the metaphor of the son who went away, and it's really helped me understand the son who stayed home. That because I'm too much of a, but how it's not fair to the son who stayed home. You know, I've always had that, regardless of how much I've heard theologically that that's not what it's about. I still think it's not fair as someone who usually follows the rules and etc. But when Carl was talking about the spiritual emptiness and of the exiled world and coming back to that, it made me see that first son never had that emptiness, you know, never felt the yearning, because he was full of something that wasn't, he just didn't feel it, you know, like the other son. Anyway, so thank you, Carl, and thank you, Father Vincent. I also wanted to say, and I mentioned this in another context, that this idea of God rushing has been so helpful for me. And I mentioned it, that it made me a better mother, and it was a little, wow, that's kind of weird. But my daughter and I have had not estrangement, but I just feel like, you know, there's been some, I just wish that there was a bigger longing between both of us. And when I gave up that idea of waiting for her and just rushed to her, it's changed everything, you know, I mean, this is short term, but it's just changed everything. That she came rushing to me. And so it was just this beautiful thing for me that has, it's just had an impact. The other thing I wanted to say is that last night I was doing Lectio Divina, and with the passage that I can't remember now, it was about Jesus telling the slave to go out into the roads and the lanes to gather people to come in.
For the
wedding. Was that the wedding? Okay. And there weren't enough people that came. And so Jesus said, go out and compel them. And so that my table will be full, or something may be filled. And for some reason, I kept hitting on compel. And I thought, that is the weirdest thing to hit on, Linda. It's just like, I don't know, it's kind of icky or something. It's too aggressive. And then I realized it's the same thing as rushing, this idea of non-passivity, and Jesus saying compel. It just felt like God rushing, or maybe the people rushing. There's something about it's not as aggressive as force, but it's stronger than invite. So it's this beautiful place in between that is, I don't know, it's just a really beautiful thing for me. I wanted to say finally that your prayer, I think it was last Saturday, that maybe it was Sunday, that said that I think you said God lay down with us tonight, and Jesus lay down with us tonight, Holy Spirit lay down with us tonight. And I haven't gone to bed without those three since. And it's been, I don't know, there's something beautiful about, I don't anthropomorphize God so much, but the Trinity was laying down with me, laying their heads on my other pillow. It was just beautiful. And so I've gone to bed with them, and they're still there in the morning. So, thank you.
Thank you, Linda. For so just a few responses to that, I'll take the last one first before I forget. That is actually that prayer, I think, was at our Tuesday night meditation, if I'm not mistaken, rather than last Saturday. But it was taken from my best memory or paraphrase of a poem or prayer from the Carmina Gadelica, the collection of Celtic hymns and prayers. And I'll try to find that for you, and I'll send it to Joanne to send to the group if that would be of interest. And then you can have the actual wording. It's beautiful prayer. It's so intimate. It's so that in that sense, that's such a beautiful Celtic sense about of that real gritty intimacy, that elemental sense of God's presence, which is lovely. So thanks. I'll look for the actual prayer and send it around. And as far as the other son, I'll deal with him next week. We're gonna look at his situation and because I think you raise a point that many of us feel like, hey, wait a minute. But I also think that a lot of the parables that Jesus tells leaves us asking, hey, wait a minute, that's not fair, or right. And I think it's precisely that sense of fairness that he's often challenging in us, and he's asking us to prefer the abundance of love and compassion over meting out fairness or justice is often the challenge. But I am still sensitive, as you are, to the plight of the brother. And what I try to bring out in what will follow in the coming week or two is that the father's reaction is identical to him. And in many ways, there's two wayward sons. One physically leaves, the other one just does what he's supposed to do, but is just as estranged from the father as the son who leaves, because there's still no real relationship there, right? He's just sort of doing his duty. And I think what Jesus is challenging there are those who would sort of just rotely follow a religious tradition or practice without really fostering the intimacy that it's supposed to ideally lead us to. And the beauty is that when that son, in his anger, runs out of the house, what does the father do? Rushes out to go get him. So there's still that same divine response of, hey, wait a minute, in this whole parable, it's the father who's chasing the kids all over the place, and they're the ones who are sort of running away. And there's such a beauty to that sense of, as for those of you who are parents will know, I don't think there could be a more painful experience than to watch your own child suffer for whatever reason. I think a parent who has to endure that, I've heard over and over again, that's a unique kind of suffering for a parent to have to endure. And I think that the father in this case, or God, is, the way this parable is told, there's a tremendous amount of pain that he's feeling, not only over the rejection, but over the lack of unity in the family, over the brother's resentment, over the hurt feelings, right? Over the sense of waywardness. And his whole mission is running after the kids to corral them back into intimacy. So I'm with you. And as we move through that, we'll have some chance to explore that aspect more deeply, I think.
Thank you. I just wanted to end with, I've often heard that phrase, would you rather be right or loving? If there's, so it's actually perfect for the prodigal son. Yeah,
exactly right. Yeah, beautifully said. Beautifully said. Hi, Pat. Did you freeze on us? Oh, no, there you go. Go ahead, Pat. I think you froze there for a brief moment. I just want to unmute yourself if you
Okay.
can.
Think again about exile. Adam and Eve, until God makes clear to them that their choice put them into exile, they don't realize that it did. The nation of Israel, their choices put them into the Babylonian exile, but they're not necessarily connecting the dots right away. But then we have the son here in this parable who comes to himself, realizes that his choices have caused exile. So that got me to thinking about this possibly being, in a sense, a representation of that deification through incarnation. Because without that, would we have the self-awareness to know that our choices put us into exile?
Pat, you couldn't have, I think you've just summarized what I would think of as the entire contemplative life of the Christian. That is exactly, I think, what the book tries to get at, that it's really about waking up to what already is, right? This dropping of illusion. And what already is that through the incarnation, the union we seek with the divine is a fait accompli. I mean, it's done, it's over. It's now a matter of us waking up to it. I mean, I'm not sure how many of you realize, for example, to your point about the Babylonian exile, that exile, Israel's exile into Babylon happened in 587 or so before Christ. It was the most devastating national disaster that Israel underwent. Begins what's called the Great Diaspora, or dispersion of the Jews right throughout the world. And there's never going back after that moment in terms of the Jewish people being dispersed throughout the world. I mean, it was an exile in Babylon that lasted some 40 years before the next king, Cyrus of Persia, who overcame the Babylonians, had a new international policy, in a sense, by which he let captives go back to their native lands and so forth, and they were able to rebuild their temple and all of that. But what's important is to understand that it's in that context during their exile that our biblical primeval myths were essentially written. The story of the chapter 1 of Genesis, 1:1 and following. And part of that is, why were those myths being written at that time? Because they're being confronted with the imperial creation myths of Babylon, which are an incredibly oppressive mythology for them, and sort of are asking themselves, how did we get into this mess, right? Is the God of the Babylons, Marduk, stronger than Yahweh? Is Yahweh back there in Israel and we're here? Because there was this sense that gods only had control over a certain degree of real estate at the time. And so there was this real theological crisis around a sort of what you could say is they kind of hit Skid Row. They were at the bottom of the barrel. And it was the time that they began to reflect on, how did we get here? And what does this mean for us? And so where do they start? They start in the beginning, and they begin to conceive their own national story from the very beginning of the origins of the universe. And this is where we get the incorporation of the Adam and Eve story ultimately, and so on. But what's fascinating about it is, as they move through that question, how did we get in this terrible state of exile? It's really the moment when Israel goes from being what we call a henotheistic faith to a monotheistic faith. And henotheistic means one. Hen is Greek for one. And henotheism is a theological tradition in which one would say there is a belief in many gods, but you're allegiant only to one of them. And up until this time of exile, that, if you really read closely all the Old Testament texts that precede this time in their history, they're very henotheistic. Take, for example, the 10 Commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. Well, that implies there's other gods, right? There's options, yeah? So this is out of a henotheistic tradition in which God is calling for allegiance. But now they say, hold on a minute. Marduk and all these gods of the Babylons and so forth, they don't even exist. There is only one God, and this God is the God of all. And we're not here because God lost to Marduk. We're here because we put ourselves into exile by abandoning the Torah, by abandoning the prophets and so on. And now we have to figure out how how it is that we turn back to that and find the restoration. So you're right, in many ways, so much of what we read about in the history of Israel is allegorical for the human plight, for the Christian spiritual life in this case. It's all our story. It's all unfolding in our own hearts and our own lives, really, in our own unique ways. Yeah. So it's a good connection to make there, for sure. Okay, Joy, good morning.
Yes, good morning, Father.
Hi there.
Yes. When the prodigal son was at the point in his life where he got to the pig pen, and he was like feeding the pigs, and he was suddenly realized that or had the understanding or was struck with sanity or whatever, this is not what I want for myself. I'm hearing that he's brought to sanity, but I think that after, we are enlightened with what kind of life that we are living, there still has to be a decision. And it was after he was enlightened about what was going on with his life that he realized that he needed to make a decision to go home. Mm-hmm. So that decision that I'm talking about, is that part of is that me, Joy, making the decision? Is that God part of that being realized and becoming more full of Christ or God or whatever? Is that decision brought on by that understanding, or is it a decision that me myself has to make?
That's a great question, Joy. And actually it's a kind of a fraught question depending on who you ask. A lot of debates have been fought over, say, like Pelagius and Augustine, about how much we are capable of making a decision versus grace in us making that decision in and through us. And I would say there's, for the sake of trying to conceive it in a concise way, there's probably a kind of maybe hybrid, whereby the decision must be our own, as we've talked about today on this forum. That the notion of the preservation of human freedom is so central to Christian faith, because that is the soil from which love can spring, is pure freedom. Right? God can't require love from us. It's not love anymore. Love has to be given freely. So that has all the attending risks of rejection of a God who is covenantal and so forth. But I do think that even before we turn and make that decision, God is continually in search of us, and is that searching never ends, right? It's our moment to turn back that enables the completion to happen, enables the sort of reconciliation, and there's that freedom. But I think the way in which we might conceive of God always searching for us are those moments of providence or of grace or of that thing that hitting rock bottom or whatever that may be, that feels to us like a punishment or an abandonment, is the thing that does turn us, just the way this young man finds himself starving in a land of famine, wanting to eat out of pig troughs, and thinks, hold on a minute, and kind of comes to his senses. One could almost argue more broadly that in the famine itself is the grace of God, is the providence of God, creating such an atmosphere as which he would be inspired to turn back and receive that grace that is seeking him. So I think that grace is always operative, that in grace being nothing more than the self-communication of God in us, right? That constant abandonment of the divine presence to ourselves, the emptying of God into us. Does that help?
Yes, I got the word hybrid.
Yeah, good. Okay. I had you. Thank you, Joy. Brandon raised a point then on the chat that might be worth looking at. Thanks, Brandon, for your question. And he's basically asking if on any level there might be an analog in the story of the prodigal son, with Jesus being serving either as the loyal or the prodigal son himself. Brandon, did I summarize that fairly? Okay, first of all, there's probably multiple ways to answer this question. The way that I'll look at it in the book in the coming paragraphs is that I think of Jesus as the kiss of the Father, rather than as one of the sons. Jesus is what the Father looks like when the Father rushes out to greet us. Jesus is the thing that makes the Father searching and finding not merely a nice idea or theoretical concept, but a real physical embrace in the flesh, if you will. It is Christ incarnate. And so to me, here we have to rely on our Trinitarian theology, where the Father and the Son in this sense are not separate, but Christ becomes, just as Christ is the word through which all things come into being, the word of God. Here, I think of Christ as the very kiss or the embrace of God to us who are the various sons, prodigal in one form or another. That's how at least I speak about it in the coming paragraphs, which we'll see in the next few weeks. But again, I don't impose that definition or that interpretation as the only one. It's one that I felt made sense in light of trying to see this parable as a retelling of Eden in light of the incarnation. That's where I see that unfolding. Okay, so how about Roman and Carmen? And we'll take that as the last question, and then we'll move to a discussion of practice. I've been aware of the last couple of weeks, we've a little bit barged in on the next group, so I want to be conscious of our time. So Roman and or Carmen, you have the floor.
It's Roman here.
Hi.
And I'm struck by your, I think it's your closing prayer about a contrite heart. And in Psalm 51, a broken spirit and a contrite heart are pleasing to God. And that it's not so much the return, but his transformation, his being broken, and having a contrite heart, that is the main point. If he had just come to the pig trough and said, oh, this isn't that good, I think I'll go home. But without that transformative movement of being broken, and it wouldn't have had the same effect. And regarding the parallel to the Garden of Eden story, I'm wondering if the sin was not the eating of the fruit, but rather the defensive attitude of Adam blaming Eve and Eve blaming the snake. Had they been broken and had a contrite heart and asked God to forgive them, I think they would have been forgiven. So that's for me the difference between this prodigal son, who doesn't get defensive, but comes to himself, and then Adam and Eve, who never did.
Yeah, Roman, that's beautiful. A couple of just thoughts that sort of rise in me as I hear your reflection. When I'm teaching my undergraduates and we get to that section of Mark's gospel, which talks about the unforgivable sin, every one of them is absolutely convinced they've committed it and are terrified at what that means. And one of the things that I really try to communicate to them is that, my exegesis or understanding of that is the unforgivable sin is the sin you don't ask forgiveness for. And then you have to ask, well, what would be the reason that I wouldn't ask forgiveness for a sin? And I think you're pointing to Adam and Eve versus the son might contain at least part of that answer. And it's because of the sort of idolatry involved in believing that whatever it is I did is somehow bigger than God's capacity to forgive it. So it isn't that God doesn't forgive the sin, it's that we never allow our faith in the vastness, the incomprehensibility of God's mercy to be the dominating narrative in our lives, and instead fall into this place of shame and self-exile where we can't bring ourselves to say, I trust that you're bigger than this. right? There's up in Folsom Prison here, there's a gentleman I know who wrote a book on toxic shame. I think I've mentioned it on this forum, and he works with how much toxic shame is involved in the history of many of the hardened criminals who are there that have led them to do, frankly, terrible things. But in unpacking this way in which childhood abuse and God knows all the kinds of neglect and abuse these men have been through, it just completely breaks them down and opens them finally to be able to acknowledge, A, what they did was heinous in some cases, but also to understand that what's been done to them has been, this shame that they carry, they can let it go. And I think it's this sort of, in a way, toxic shame that Adam and Eve can't let go of. And so the end of the story of Adam and Eve for the Christian is not exile forever. It's, okay, you're in exile and you're dealing with all the shame, so I'm going to come out and I'm going to find you and bring you back, right? So for the Christian, the prodigal son is how Eden ends. And that's the incarnation being the response or the divine amelioration to human shame and our incapacity to ask for forgiveness is to just actively come out and bring us home, right? But the spiritual life, to come back to an earlier point, is then about waking up to that and coming to our senses as the prodigal son does, and realizing God has been chasing me all along. And what a beautiful moment of rejoicing that is when in our hearts we know that.
Thank you. And just the final thought, this is Julian in Norwich, who says, blessed is the fall also, because it leads to the redemption. So blessed was his decision to go there and waste all his money, because that resulted in real transformation. Whereas the other brother was stuck in the pride of innocence and of being such a goody two shoes.
Yeah, right. And the good one. Yeah, I mean, and upcoming in a few weeks at our Easter Vigil, insofar as we'll be celebrating it this year, is that beautiful chant that recalls salvation history, and that's usually chanted by our deacons, the Exultet. O happy fault, O necessary sin of Adam, that gained for us so great a Redeemer. I cannot listen to that during the vigil and not weep, because the beauty of how grace transforms, the abundance of that is just unfathomable, really. It just turns everything on its head. It's a beautiful thing.
Thank you, Father.
And to come back then to your reference to the prayer, it's what I tried to communicate in the prayer today is, the prayer for God to rush into those dark places before I get there. So by the time I get there, your love has already transformed it. Your love is already waiting for me. So even as I fall, I'm caught, right? So it's beautiful. This is when we get to realize that this is where we understand the older son's pride, to your point, even an innocent one, that it truly is not about ritual. It is truly not, and by that I mean not about observance of certain rules and laws. All of the rituals, our liturgies, our prayers are all meant to bring us to this place of intimacy and become really idolatrous when they're performed for their own sake, right? So how do we allow the power of our sacraments and rituals to, just like the scriptures, like with the slatted fence we talked about so long ago, to lead us to that interior place rather than become ends in themselves where we just perfunctory follow them? That's sort of the pride of the other son. I've been doing all my duties. I've been doing everything you ask. What is this about? But you haven't seen that we've been living together. You're my son. There's been no relationship here other than you acting like another worker, right? And so all of our religious traditions come to naught if they don't open us to this intimacy. So thank you, Roman, for that reflection. Okay, let's take a few moments then and just see if folks would like to share anything about the practices. I know for some of you, you need to get on with your day. So if that's the case, Benum Christinet, I wish you the best, and I hope to see you on next Saturday. But I'll call up, for those of you who can stay behind, let me call up the Let's see, where are we here? Our Lectio from last week. Oh, wait, first I have to give you Lectio for this week. I forgot to give you one. I'm so sorry. I just realized that now. I never came up with one. So make one up and we'll talk about it in our next time. But we can look at the parable of the prodigal son and any Lectio that some of you have been doing on it in the meantime. That's what we talked about the last time we were together. And my apologies for forgetting to insert one this week. I don't know why I did that. The practice, the invitation was to pray Lectio on the prodigal son, which is Luke 15:11-24. And I'll stop the screen share and open up the floor to any of you who might want to share. What did you come to even before this conversation, or where have you been in terms of that? Christine, please.
In doing Lectio on this passage, what stood out for me this time was when the son had spent everything. And in my own life, I was the good daughter, the eldest daughter, who always did everything right. And I really had to come to the end of myself and realize that my midlife crisis that had brought me to a place of total devastation and the end of myself. And all I could do was pray, God help me, God help me. What I needed and what finally happened was that Christ came incarnate through another. And it was through her that I came to know Jesus in a way I never had before and had an incredible healing experience with him. And so my challenge today then is to look for the lost one, to look for the one who's praying, God help me, and be the one who comes in the name of God, show the love of the Father or the Mother. Yeah, so that was my reflection on the past.
What I love about that, Christine, is that I think in many ways it really gets to the heart of what I'm trying to weave throughout the book, which is that prayer becomes embodiment. You become the hands, the feet, the eyes, the ears, right, of Christ for another. And this is what it is, right? This is when we recognize that that I am an extension of Christ in the world, a member of Christ's body, and then can embody that love, embody that light by becoming that for another. This is where transformation happens. And it's a beautiful meditation, because I could not agree with you more of the urgency around us each seeing that in our own little way. You know, it's beautiful. Yeah, very rich. Thank you.
As I reflected on that beautiful passage, the other son kept coming up to me. And it seems that he had not read 1 Corinthians 13, because had he done so, he may have realized that he lacked love. You know, the fact that he couldn't rejoice. And I know, you know, I often fail to rejoice in the success of others, you know, so I definitely need saving as well. But thank God I know that now.
And that's the difference. You know, Robert, you remind me that, you know, what I was getting at even just a few minutes ago, this return to God is a continual, perpetual return in our hearts, in our lives, in our thoughts, in our actions. And that's a beautiful thing. And it reminds me, you know, we heard somebody earlier, you know, talk about blessed is the fall. Roman was talking about that. If you think, one of the things we'll get to in chapter 4 is this question on asceticism. And I really think of asceticism as prayer turned inside out. In many ways, it's prayer. We face the same challenges in our meditation that we do in our practice of the faith. And so if we think of every time we are in meditation and our thoughts wander, it becomes an invitation to turn again, becomes an invitation to come to ourself, right? To come to our senses and to allow God to rush out in that moment and bring us back to our hearts. So every distraction in prayer is not an invitation to frustration, but an invitation to heaven rejoicing over the new opportunity for us to turn again to God, right? And so the distractions we encounter in meditation, to me, are parallel to the moments we fail or fall in life. They're invitations to stand again, to reach out again, to ask for mercy again, to allow God to reach out and take us home again. But to your point, Robert, all we have to do is know that and to see that. And the mistake too many of us make, and I think unfortunately we make that mistake because religion has either overtly or discreetly inculcated that, is that this question around worthiness and being unworthy and right, the sin-soaked forms of Christianity that many of us are just all too familiar with, forget that there is no end to the boundless love of God. And that is not that does not lead us to a kind of wishy-washy, I can do no wrong Christianity. It puts the horse before the cart rather than cart before the horse. Morality does not then become me trying to prove myself before God. That's Pharisaism. Jesus put away that whole approach. It is first recognizing I am heir and son and daughter of the divine. And so morality flows from recognizing that dignity of being a child of God, flows from the realization that God has already rushed out to bring me home, has donned me with the best robe and the best sandals and the biggest ring and so forth, and has already endowed me with this beautiful sense of identity and dignity. And then I turn and say, all of that other stuff that I keep getting caught up in is beneath me. And when I find myself getting caught up in that, it's the love of God, as Paul says, the love of Christ compels me. The love of Christ compels me. It's the love of Christ, not the condemnation of the Father. That's what compels us. To know we are already saved, and that whole life of famine and waywardness is just simply beneath us, beneath our dignity. And when we fall into it again, we only have to remember our dignity. So I am not preaching a Christianity without ethics and morality. I'm preaching a Christianity that is not based on divine approval for my actions, right? Paul says, Christ came while we were still sinners. He is not waiting at the finish line for us to perfect ourselves. Or as Thelma, who's here today, says, right, the church is a hospital. We come because we're broken. I have come for sinners, not for the healthy. I mean, we hear this message over and over again, and yet religiously, institutionally, we keep converting it. We revert back to a kind of Pharisaism. But the joy of the Christian life, the reason the gospel is good news, is precisely because we are loved first. So every moment, every fall becomes a moment, right, to stand and to be lifted up again. Every distraction in prayer becomes an invitation to turn and for heaven to rejoice. I mean, think of the difference of what that has in our own spiritual life, our own psychological life, to see that this is what Jesus is, in fact, I think, preaching. And how different that is when we come to a God like that, because that's a God we can fearlessly be intimate with. It's a whole new ball of wax. So thank you, Robert, for bringing me to that sort of realization in this talk today, is the relevance for that.
Thank you.
Okay, Linda, please. Hi.
Hi. What struck me, one of the things when I was reading it, was the intensity of the love of the Father, because he says it twice. First to the servant, it says, go get the fatted calf and all that. And he says, for this son of mine was dead.
Right.
And is alive again. And then again to his son, he says, but we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead,
right,
and has come to life. That's pretty intense and pretty final. And, to have believed it that way and love him that much, when he saw him again, he was dead to him.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, this is where, we're seeing resonances, I think, in the notion of the radical breakdown of this particular family, which in Judaism, family is the center of Jewish faith. So there is a complete breakdown in what this son does. And indeed, by telling the father, "You're as good as dead to me," in a sense is a way of, there is a kind of death between them that emerges out of that, decision by the son, if you want to say. So there is indeed a rebirth, a resurrection, a new life that comes about, and it's very powerful. You're right to observe that. Yeah. And again, I want to just point out that death and resurrection for all of us can happen multiple times in our day, in our life, in a moment, in a moment of prayer. There's the dying and the rising is an ongoing thing that happens consistently. Thank you. So thank you, Linda, for that. Yeah, highlighting that piece. Nora, please. Nora, sweetie, you just want to make sure you unmute there. So Nora, you're not,
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. What I'm struck by is the inadequacy of language to express God's love. I think we really don't have language for it. I read the Aramaic text from the Peshitta, and so it says there that the Father threw himself. Let me just say here. He says he threw himself. Oh, wait a minute here. Fell on his neck and kissed him. Fell on his neck and kissed him. And then the poor man, i.e. God, is reduced to giving him all these material things. We're led to think of God's love with rings and fat calves and shoes on our feet, and it's so inadequate. It is so inadequate because we can't, I think there are no words. And I always think of Dag Hammarskjöld's saying, "The God whom I know, but I cannot name." And I'm left with that idea that we can't even describe this. This is so pitiful a description of God's love. That's all I can say.
Thank you, Laura. That brings us to the apophatic, as it were, the theology that leads to silence beyond words because we realize the inadequacy of our language. The way that one of the most brilliant Christian scholars of apophaticism in the modern world, Dennis Turner, wrote a beautiful book called The Darkness of God. I don't necessarily recommend it because it's a little bit of a thick book to get through. But if you are interested in apophatic theology, I don't know if you can do better. But he basically says, what he calls the prolixity of our language ultimately collapses in on itself and becomes self-subversive. In other words, we speak and speak and speak, and we come up with all these analogies, and then we realize we're just tongue-tied, we're tripping over ourselves, and we're just reduced to an exhausted silence where we say, there's nothing left to say, and I still haven't said it, and there's so much more to say, but nothing I say is going to get there. So I'm done, right? I'm just going to sit here in silence and relish in this. And this is really true apophaticism, true, St. Augustine, for example, says, in the end, we know God is unknowable.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. And God knows that St. Augustine wrote an awful lot. For somebody who wrote that much, to then at the end of it all say, yep, it's a noble. Or even worse, Aquinas, who told his secretary, burn it, it's all straw. There's a joke in a lot of seminaries that said his secretary should have listened to him. But of course, here you have a man that spends his entire life, profusely speaking about God, and spends the last 2 years of his life in utter silence and said, this is worthless. Everything I've said is worthless. It gets you nowhere. So we come to the mystic where we cannot know God in our minds. We cannot, as the fathers would say, comprehend God in our minds, but we can apprehend God in love in our hearts. And that's the only true way of beginning to get a glimpse of this immensity. And it begins with a breakdown of a recognition of the incapacity of our language and minds. Yeah.
Well, I think what has happened is that it has led to sort of the smells and bells approach, that has led us astray, if you will, in some way, that we, put the emphasis on that, and it's not about that at all. It has its part, but I think all these attempts to name God, to name that love, is the foundation for ritual.
Indeed, and one of the things that Dennis Turner taught me that I had not realized before, but he says so much more beautifully than I'm about to, is so coming to an apophatic theology, or a theology of silence, whereby we just can't say anymore. He says it's that you have a very weak apophatic theology if it's one that you've chosen. In other words, if you just choose to be silent, you have a very weak silence there, because his point is a real apophatic theology, a robust, authentic apophatic theology, is one that we arrive at only after we have attempted to say and do everything. And by language here, he's not talking merely about the spoken word, but he is talking about everything from art to music to ritual to smells and bells to theological books to commentaries, you name it, the whole thing, anything at all that we put out there as a way of knowing, celebrating, and speaking about this divine love. That's what he means by the language. And he says you have to do it all. And to his point, if you look to the Eastern Orthodox, who have perhaps the most lavish kinds of liturgies from Western points of view, almost to a fault. It's almost so laden and thick with layer upon layer upon layer. It's almost cluttered in its sort of symbolism. But nevertheless, that is the same tradition that has also carried forward most clearly the Jesus prayer, or the prayer of silence. Right. So right there within Eastern Orthodoxy, you have kind of the kitschiness of layering and layering and layering, and at the same time have beautifully carried forward the prayer of imagelessness. So that, I don't think that's a contradiction within that tradition. And I think that there's something to be said for the messiness of really trying to reach beyond a simple silence and more toward an exhausted silence. And I agree with him on that. I thought that was a profound insight on his part. So okay, so Carl, please, I see your hand.
Just a very short comment that there's another way of looking at that. First of all, it's not the inadequacy of our language that's being pointed to. It's God's God's reaction to the turning towards of the Son by the Son. And God speaks not in a literal language, I love you, I love you, but the language of symbol, which is so much bigger than literal language. The language of the ring and the robe and the sandal and the fatted calf. These speak to the immensity of the material world, which is an expression of that divine embrace. That's all I wanted to say.
I find your language inadequate, Carl. Kidding. No, your insight is I think spot on. And indeed, you're right that to sort of build on that, the God who is who Augustine says is known as unknowable, the very God that is revealed by Jesus is unknowable in the sense of being beyond intellectual comprehension, and yet is known in everything. So the one who bears no name can be named in everything.
Right. It's a divine embrace. It
Yeah.
enfolds you.
Right.
Yep.
Right. Yeah, it's in, you know, the whole notion of perichoresis, often spoken of as, you know, the members of the Trinity all eternally dancing and interpenetrating one another in this constant emptying and pouring each one out into the other. There's this dynamic relationality overflows in the incarnation, and that's, you know, Philippians talks about that kenosis, that self-emptying of the divine in Christ. That dance interpenetrates, embraces everything, so that everything we name that is good and beautiful, and everything we can name at all, is somehow a name for God, is an expression of the divine. So at the same moment, we have God who is beyond any comprehension and any nameability, and yet is named in everything. And so we can take that in a million directions, but you see that even when we celebrate the Eucharist, there's sort of the presence of Christ particularized, sacramentalized in that moment, in bread and wine, in gathered community. And yet that speaks to the universal presence of Christ in everything. So there's this continuity between the two that when we really grasp it, you're right, Carl, I think speaks to the world of archetype, allegory, metaphor, mythology, which is much richer than the mere veneer of history itself could ever reveal to us. It's the depths of what goes on in the midst of that you need sort of eyes of faith to be able to perceive. Right. It's a beautiful thing. So thank you for your comment. So we are nearing the end of our time without infringing on our brothers and sisters who are coming in just a few minutes. So perhaps this is a good time to close. Christina, final comment? I saw your hand jump up there.
Yes. I just wanted to share that my husband Gary and I, we've been watching this great course of pictures taken by the Hubble telescope. And we're just in awe of the absolute, well, there are no words to explain the beauty and gloriousness of this. It's like hearing angels singing without voice. I mean, it's the song in pictures. It's light. If you've ever seen any of the pictures from the Hubble telescope, you know what I'm talking about. Beyond words.
Totally. And Christine, if you don't mind sharing that with Joanne, who maybe could just forward that to us or put it in the chat. If there's a specific link, I would love for us to see what it is you're looking at. And to your point, I mean, that comes back to the extravagance. Who's it all for?
And here we are, this little thing, or this or nothing.
Nothing at all. I know. You know, I watched a year and a half ago time lapse over the course of 18 minutes of the history of the universe projecting to its ultimate sort of conclusion as science can best determine at this point. And it's a time lapse where every second or two, the time speeds up exponentially into the trillions and trillions of years. And the universe is going to go on for so long that the whole arising of our solar system and our planet and its demise will happen so quickly as to almost be unregisterable in the vast history of the whole galaxy. It's a flash of light. It's a blip that's barely recognizable, the blink of an eye. That is just incomprehensible. And then to think that all of that is held in the palm of God's hand, is held in the heart of God, who is vaster still. I mean, then you really start to realize we don't know anything. It's almost ridiculous. But yeah, it's beautiful and a little bit terrifying, but in this awe-inspiring kind of way, you know. So if you have a link that you could share. Oh, is that what's up there now?
Yeah, link? What we're watching is actually from what do they call it? The courses. The great courses. And it's all about pictures of the Hubble universe.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, we'll take a look
Yeah.
at that then. Thank you. Well, thank you for a fun, as always, and enlivening group together. I so look forward to this, and I'll miss you until next Saturday. I hope your Lenten journeys are going well, and that you're really deepening into that intimacy with God and Christ. And I assure you that I will keep you in my prayers, as always. In the silence of that, we'll hold each other there until we meet again. And so I bid you go with my blessing, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Be safe and be loving and be joyful. All right, and we'll see you very soon. Okay.